The morning sun cast long shadows across the BBC studios as Charles Windsor stepped out of his black Bentley. It was 1994, and the future king had agreed to what would become one of the most controversial interviews in royal history. Documentary filmmaker Jonathan Dimbleby had spent months convincing the palace that this candid conversation would help repair Charles's image after his messy separation from Diana. Charles walked through the corridors with nervous energy, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floors. He had prepared for weeks, rehearsing answers with his private secretary and media advisors. This interview was supposed to be his chance to tell his side of the story, to show the public that he was more than just tabloid headlines and scandal. The studio was smaller than Charles had expected. Camera equipment lined the walls and technicians moved quietly, checking lights and sound levels. Dimbleby greeted him warmly, trying to ease the tension that filled the room like thick fog. The prince took his seat in a burgundy leather chair, adjusting his tie one final time. What Charles didn't know was that this interview would reveal more than he ever intended. Hidden beneath his practiced responses and careful word choices lay truths that would shake the monarchy to its core. As the cameras began rolling, Charles felt confident that he could control the narrative. He had been trained his entire life to present the right image, to say the right words at the right moments. The first questions were gentle, almost friendly. Dimbleby asked about his childhood, his education, his vision for Britain's future. Charles relaxed slightly, his shoulders dropping as he settled into the rhythm of conversation. He spoke about his love for architecture, his passion for organic farming, his concerns about environmental issues. These were safe topics, areas where his knowledge and genuine interest shone through. But Dimbleby was building toward something bigger. The journalist had done his research, uncovered details that palace officials had hoped would remain buried forever. As the interview progressed, the questions became sharper, more pointed. Charles began to shift in his chair, his carefully composed expression showing small cracks of uncertainty. The lighting in the studio seemed to grow hotter as time passed. Sweat formed on Charles's forehead, though he tried to maintain his composure. His media training kicked in, reminding him to keep his voice steady, to maintain eye contact with Dimbleby rather than looking directly at the cameras. Millions of people would eventually watch this interview, dissecting every word, every gesture, every pause. Outside the studio, palace officials waited anxiously. They had negotiated editorial control over the final cut, believing they could protect Charles from any damaging revelations. The prince's private secretary paced the hallway, checking his watch repeatedly. This interview was supposed to last 2 hours, but it was already running longer than planned. As the conversation continued, Charles found himself saying things he had never intended to reveal publicly. The comfortable atmosphere Dimbleby had created, combined with the prince's desire to finally tell his truth, loosened his tongue in ways that would have horrified his advisors. He spoke about feeling misunderstood, about the loneliness of his position, about struggles that the public had never glimpsed. The most dangerous moment came when Dimbleby asked about adultery. Charles had been warned this question might arise, but hearing it spoken aloud in the studio made his heart race. His advisors had coached him to deflect, to redirect, to avoid giving any direct answers. But something in Dimbleby's manner, something in the way the question was posed, caught Charles off guard. The truth hung in the air between them, waiting to be spoken or buried forever. The words tumbled out before Charles could stop them. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was unfaithful to my marriage." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Camera operators glanced at each other, hardly believing what they had just recorded. Dimbleby pressed forward gently, sensing that this moment would define the entire interview. Charles continued speaking, his reserve crumbling as months of pent-up emotion poured forth. He talked about Camilla Parker Bowles, about love that had endured for decades despite royal protocol and public expectation. He described feeling trapped in a marriage that had become a performance, a fairy tale that existed only for the cameras and the crowds. The technical crew worked silently around them, but everyone in the studio understood they were witnessing history being made. This wasn't just another royal interview filled with diplomatic non-answers and careful phrases. This was a future king laying bare his most intimate secrets, admitting to failures that would normally remain hidden behind palace walls forever. As Charles spoke about his relationship with Diana, his voice carried years of frustration and regret. He explained how they had tried to make their marriage work, how they had both suffered under the weight of public scrutiny and private incompatibility. The fairy tale wedding that millions had watched on television had been built on hope rather than genuine connection. Dimbleby listened with the skill of an experienced interviewer, knowing when to probe deeper and when to let silence draw out even more revelations. Charles talked about the loneliness of royal life, about feeling misunderstood by both the public and his own family. He spoke about his mother's disappointment, about pressure from his father, about carrying the weight of an institution that stretched back over 1,000 years. The interview stretched on for nearly 4 hours, far longer than anyone had anticipated. Charles seemed unable to stop talking, as if years of diplomatic silence had finally burst open like a dam. He discussed his childhood fears, his struggles with confidence, his desperate desire to be seen as more than just a symbol or a tabloid headline. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, an uncomfortable silence filled the studio. Everyone present knew they had just recorded something extraordinary, something that would change the royal family forever. Charles sat back in his chair, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what he had just revealed to the world. Dimbleby thanked him professionally, but the journalist's excitement was barely contained. This interview would make his career, establish him as one of Britain's most important documentary makers. Charles shook hands with the crew, his royal training taking over even as his mind raced with the implications of his confessions. The tape containing Charles's admissions was immediately secured in a locked case. BBC executives understood the explosive nature of what they possessed. This wasn't just news. This was dynamite that could bring down the monarchy itself. Plans were made for careful editing, for legal review, for the delicate process of preparing such sensitive material for broadcast. But Charles was already having second thoughts. As his car pulled away from the BBC studios, the full weight of his revelations began to sink in. He had said things that could never be unsaid, admitted truths that would follow him for the rest of his life. The temporary relief he had felt from finally speaking honestly was quickly being replaced by growing panic about the consequences. The emergency meeting was called for 6 o'clock that evening at Clarence House. Charles's private secretary had assembled the prince's closest advisors, legal counsel, and media specialists. The mood in the ornate drawing room was grave as Charles recounted what had transpired during the interview. With each revelation he described, faces around the mahogany table grew more concerned. Sir Robert Fellows, the Queen's private secretary and Diana's brother-in-law, sat rigid in his chair. The implications were staggering. Charles had not only admitted to adultery but had done so on camera, creating permanent evidence that could be broadcast to millions of viewers worldwide. The constitutional crisis this could trigger made everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable. Charles's legal advisor, Sir Michael Peet, was already calculating the potential damage. Public admission of adultery by a future king was unprecedented in modern times. The Church of England, which Charles would someday lead as supreme governor, maintained strict positions on marriage and fidelity. This revelation could undermine his eventual coronation, question his moral authority, and provide ammunition for Republican movements across the Commonwealth. The discussion quickly turned to damage control. Could the interview be edited to remove the most damaging portions? Had Charles signed any agreements that would prevent the BBC from broadcasting certain segments? The legal team scrambled through contracts and release forms looking for any clause that might provide protection. Meanwhile, across London at the BBC, executives were facing their own dilemma. The interview footage was locked in a secure vault, accessible only to a handful of senior staff members. News of its explosive content had already begun to leak through the building, creating an atmosphere of barely contained excitement mixed with professional concern. Jonathan Dimbleby found himself at the center of a media storm before the interview had even been edited. Word had somehow reached newspaper editors that something significant had happened during the filming. His phone rang constantly with offers, threats, and desperate pleas for information about what Charles had revealed. Back at Clarence House, Charles paced the length of his study, a room lined with first-edition books and family photographs. The weight of his mistake was becoming clearer with each passing hour. He had been so focused on telling his side of the story that he had forgotten the broader implications of his words. The monarchy itself could be damaged by his admissions. His mother, Queen Elizabeth, had not yet been informed of the full extent of his revelations. The task of briefing the sovereign fell to Sir Robert Fellows, who dreaded the conversation. The Queen had weathered many family scandals over the decades, but this situation was different. This time, her heir had voluntarily placed the institution itself at risk. The media machinery that surrounded the royal family began working overtime to assess the damage and explore options. Palace lawyers contacted their counterparts at the BBC, initiating preliminary discussions about editorial control and potential modifications to the final broadcast version. Charles's youngest brother, Prince Edward, who had experience in television production, was quietly consulted about the technical possibilities of altering the interview footage. Could damaging segments be removed without making the editing obvious? Were there ways to minimize the impact while still honoring the BBC's journalistic integrity? As night fell over London, emergency sessions continued in both Clarence House and Broadcasting House. The BBC's Board of Governors was convened for an extraordinary meeting to discuss the implications of broadcasting such sensitive material. The corporation had a duty to report news, but they also had responsibilities to consider national stability and constitutional implications. Charles spent a sleepless night replaying every moment of the interview in his mind. He remembered the feeling of relief as he finally spoke truths he had carried for years. But that relief had been replaced by a growing sense of dread. The future of the monarchy might hang in the balance because of a few unguarded moments in a television studio. The next morning brought a flurry of urgent phone calls between Buckingham Palace and the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister's office was briefed on the situation, and constitutional experts were quietly consulted about the potential ramifications of a future king admitting adultery on national television. Charles arrived at Buckingham Palace for a private audience, with his mother at precisely 9 o'clock. The Queen received him in her private sitting room, a space usually reserved for family conversations away from the formal protocols of royal business. Her expression was unreadable as Charles explained the full extent of his revelations during the Dimbleby interview. Queen Elizabeth listened without interruption, her decades of experience in managing royal crises evident in her composed demeanor. When Charles finished his account, she was silent for several long moments before speaking. Her words were measured and careful, but Charles could hear the deep concern beneath her diplomatic tone. The monarchy had survived many challenges over the centuries, but this situation required immediate and decisive action. Within hours, palace lawyers were engaged in intense negotiations with BBC executives. The initial discussions focused on editorial control and the possibility of significant changes to the interview before broadcast. The palace argued that certain segments could be considered private conversations that had extended beyond the agreed scope of the documentary. At the BBC, pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Newspaper editors were calling hourly, desperate for any information about the interview's content. Rumors were spreading through London's media community that Charles had made shocking admissions. Though the specific details remained closely guarded secrets, Jonathan Dimbleby found himself in an impossible position. As a journalist, he was committed to broadcasting the truth, but he also understood the constitutional implications of the material he had captured. The interview represented the story of his career, but it also carried the potential to destabilize the British political system. Charles's legal team proposed a radical solution during a tense meeting at the BBC's headquarters. They suggested that the most damaging portions of the interview be removed entirely, with the explanation that technical difficulties had made certain segments unusable. This approach would allow the documentary to proceed while protecting the monarchy from the most serious revelations. BBC lawyers rejected this proposal immediately. The corporation's journalistic integrity would be permanently damaged if they were perceived as covering up royal scandals. They had a legal and ethical obligation to their viewers to present an honest account of the interview, even if that account proved uncomfortable for the palace. As negotiations continued, Charles made an increasingly desperate decision. He requested a private meeting with the BBC's Director General, hoping that a personal appeal might succeed where legal arguments had failed. The meeting was arranged for the following day at a neutral location, away from both the palace and broadcasting house. The strain of the situation was beginning to show on Charles's face. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of sleepless nights and constant worry. His private secretary noted that the prince was becoming increasingly agitated, snapping at staff members and struggling to concentrate on his regular royal duties. Meanwhile, Diana's representatives were monitoring the situation closely. News of Charles's interview had reached her legal team, and they were preparing for the potential impact on ongoing divorce negotiations. If Charles's admissions became public, they could significantly strengthen Diana's position in any settlement discussions. The Queen summoned her most trusted advisors for an emergency meeting that evening. The discussion focused on worst-case scenarios and contingency plans. If the interview was broadcast with Charles's admissions intact, the government might need to consider whether he remained suitable as heir to the throne. Such discussions had not taken place since the abdication crisis of 1936. Security around the BBC studios was quietly increased as rumors continued to spread about the interview's explosive content. Palace officials worried that details might leak to tabloid newspapers before they could resolve the situation through diplomatic channels. The longer the negotiations continued, the greater the risk that the story would break through unofficial sources. The meeting between Charles and the BBC's Director General took place in a private dining room at the Garrick Club, away from the prying eyes of journalists and photographers. Charles arrived first, choosing a corner table where their conversation would be less likely to be overheard. When the Director General entered, the weight of the situation was immediately apparent in both men's expressions. Charles began with a personal appeal, speaking about his family's centuries of service to the nation and the potential damage that broadcasting his unguarded admissions could cause. He emphasized that he had spoken in a moment of emotional vulnerability, revealing private thoughts that were never intended for public consumption. The Director General listened respectfully but remained non-committal about any changes to the planned broadcast. The conversation stretched on for nearly 2 hours, with Charles becoming increasingly desperate in his arguments. He offered exclusive future access to royal events, promised cooperation with other BBC projects, and even suggested financial compensation for any losses the corporation might suffer from not broadcasting the complete interview. But the BBC's position remained firm. The public had a right to know what their future king had said, especially when those statements concerned his fitness for the throne. The corporation's credibility depended on maintaining editorial independence, even when that independence conflicted with royal preferences. That same evening, Charles made his most dramatic decision yet. He called an emergency meeting with his senior advisors and announced his intention to invoke rarely used legal provisions that could potentially prevent the broadcast entirely. The plan involved claiming that the interview had been conducted under false pretenses and that his comments were protected by royal privilege. The legal strategy was risky and unprecedented. No member of the royal family had ever attempted to suppress media coverage through the courts in such a direct manner. The action would likely fail, but it might buy enough time to explore other options or negotiate a compromise solution. Palace lawyers worked through the night preparing injunction papers, while BBC legal teams prepared their defense. The case would likely be heard within days, creating a public legal battle that would draw even more attention to the original interview content. As news of the potential legal action leaked to the press, media organizations across Britain began preparing their own coverage of the unfolding drama. The story was becoming bigger than just Charles's admissions. It was now a constitutional crisis involving press freedom, royal privilege, and the future of the monarchy itself. Charles's decision to fight the broadcast legally had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of containing the story, his actions were generating even more interest in what he had said during the interview. Speculation grew more intense as journalists tried to piece together the full scope of his revelations. The Queen was reportedly furious about her son's handling of the situation. Palace sources suggested that she felt Charles had made a series of increasingly poor decisions that were damaging the monarchy's reputation. The legal action in particular was seen as a serious mistake that would only draw more attention to the original problem. Behind the scenes, government officials were becoming increasingly concerned about the constitutional implications of the crisis. The Prime Minister's office was quietly exploring whether Parliament might need to become involved if the situation continued to escalate. Charles himself was becoming increasingly isolated as the crisis deepened. Several of his closest advisors had privately expressed doubt about his judgment in both giving the interview and then attempting to suppress it. The prince, who had hoped to rehabilitate his public image, was instead facing the most serious challenge of his life. The BBC announced that they would proceed with their original broadcast schedule despite the threatened legal action. The interview was scheduled to air in just 5 days, and preparation for transmission was already underway. Charles was running out of time and options to prevent what he saw as a catastrophic mistake from becoming public knowledge. With legal avenues appearing futile and diplomatic negotiations stalled, Charles made his most extreme decision yet. During a private meeting with his inner circle at Highgrove House, he issued what would become known as the destruction order. Every copy of the interview tape was to be eliminated, erasing any evidence of his damaging admissions. The plan was audacious and desperate. Charles's team would need to identify every location where copies of the interview existed and arrange for their simultaneous destruction. The BBC had master tapes, backup copies, and working versions in multiple locations. Security would need to be compromised, staff would need to be convinced or coerced, and the entire operation would have to be completed before anyone noticed what was happening. Sir Michael Peat, Charles's legal advisor, strongly objected to the plan. The destruction of media materials was potentially illegal, and if discovered, would create a scandal far worse than anything revealed in the original interview. But Charles was beyond rational calculation. He saw only one way to save his future and the monarchy itself. The operation began at midnight on a Tuesday. Palace security personnel, claiming to be conducting routine inspections, gained access to BBC facilities. They were accompanied by technical specialists who understood exactly which materials needed to be destroyed and how to eliminate them without leaving obvious traces. The main BBC vault was the first target. Guards were told that royal security required inspection of the facility due to potential terrorist threats. While they were distracted, the interview tapes were located and replaced with blank media. The destruction was methodical and professional, carried out by people who understood the gravity of what they were doing. Simultaneously, similar operations were taking place at Jonathan Dimbleby's production company offices and at a secure storage facility in West London, where backup copies were kept. The coordination required split-second timing and absolute secrecy. Any delay or discovery would expose the entire conspiracy. At Dimbleby's office, the approach was more subtle. A gas leak was reported, requiring immediate evacuation of the building. During the chaos, palace operatives entered the production suite and located the editing copies of the interview. These tapes were removed and replaced with corrupted versions that would appear to have been damaged accidentally. The most challenging target was the BBC's emergency backup facility in Birmingham. This location required a more elaborate deception involving fake utility workers who claimed to be investigating electrical problems that could potentially damage sensitive recording equipment. The tapes were located and destroyed within hours. By dawn, Charles's operatives had successfully eliminated what they believed to be every copy of the interview. The palace breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the crisis had been averted. Plans were made to announce that technical difficulties had made the interview unsuitable for broadcast, and the story would quietly disappear from public attention. But the operation was not as successful as Charles believed. During the frantic night of destruction, his team had missed one crucial location. A single copy of the interview had been stored in an off-site security facility that even the BBC executives had forgotten about. This facility, used for archival storage of particularly sensitive materials, contained a complete unedited recording of Charles's explosive admissions. The existence of this final copy was known to only one person, a junior technician named David Morrison, who had been responsible for creating backup archives. Morrison had personally transported the tape to the secure facility as part of routine procedures, but the chaos surrounding the interview had prevented him from updating the official records. When Morrison arrived at work the next morning to discover that all interview materials had been mysteriously destroyed or corrupted, he realized that something extraordinary was happening. His knowledge of the surviving tape suddenly made him the most important person in British media. He faced a choice that would determine whether Charles's desperate gamble had succeeded, or whether the truth would still emerge to change history forever. David Morrison sat in his small London flat, staring at the unassuming tape cassette that contained enough explosive material to bring down the British monarchy. The 28-year-old technician had spent 3 sleepless nights considering his options since discovering that he possessed the only surviving copy of Charles's interview. Morrison understood the magnitude of what he held. The tape contained Charles's admission of adultery, his criticism of royal protocols, and intimate details about his failed marriage to Diana. If released, it would trigger the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in what amounted to a cover-up of historic proportions. The BBC had officially announced that technical difficulties had made the Charles interview unsuitable for broadcast. Jonathan Dimbleby had been informed that all materials were corrupted beyond repair, and the documentary project was being cancelled indefinitely. The media had speculated briefly about the cancellation, but without access to the actual content, the story had quickly faded from headlines. Charles, meanwhile, was experiencing what he believed to be salvation. Palace officials noted a dramatic improvement in his mood and demeanor. He had resumed his regular royal duties with renewed confidence, believing that his moment of weakness would never see the light of day. The destruction operation had cost enormous sums and required calling in numerous favors, but it appeared to have been successful. Morrison's decision came during a chance encounter with his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Sarah Chen, a retired journalist who had covered royal affairs for the Times for over 3 decades. During a casual conversation about the cancelled documentary, Mrs. Chen mentioned how disappointed she was that the public would never learn what Charles had actually said. That evening, Morrison made contact with Mrs. Chen and revealed the existence of the surviving tape. Her reaction was immediate and intense. As a journalist, she understood that this was potentially the story of the century. As a British citizen, she recognized the constitutional implications of what Charles had revealed and then tried to suppress. Together, they developed a plan to ensure the interview's contents would reach the public, despite the palace's efforts. Mrs. Chen used her contacts to arrange a meeting with senior editors at The Guardian, a newspaper known for its independence from royal influence and its commitment to press freedom. The meeting took place on a rainy Thursday evening in a private room at a discreet hotel near Paddington Station. Morrison brought the tape, while Mrs. Chen provided the journalistic credibility needed to convince skeptical editors that this was authentic and significant. When the tape was played, the room fell into stunned silence. Charles's admissions were even more damaging than anyone had imagined. Beyond the adultery confession, he had criticized his mother's reign, questioned whether the monarchy would survive into the next century, and revealed private conversations with government ministers. The Guardian's editor-in-chief made the decision to publish immediately. The newspaper's legal team was consulted. Security measures were implemented to protect the tape and the witnesses, and plans were made for the most explosive royal story in decades. The story broke on a Sunday morning with a front-page headline that would be remembered for generations: "The interview Charles tried to destroy." The article contained extensive quotes from the tape, detailed accounts of the destruction operation, and analysis of the constitutional crisis that would inevitably follow. Charles learned of the publication while attending Sunday service at a church near Balmoral. His private secretary approached him during communion, whispering the devastating news. The prince's face turned pale as he realized that his desperate gamble had not only failed, but had created an even bigger scandal than the original interview would have caused: the revelation that Charles had ordered the destruction of media materials, triggered investigations by Parliament, Scotland Yard, and media regulators. His actions were seen as an unprecedented attack on press freedom and democratic principles. The man who had hoped to save his reputation had instead destroyed any remaining public trust in his judgment and character. David Morrison became both a hero and a target. Press freedom organizations celebrated his courage in preserving historical truth, while royal loyalists condemned him as a traitor. He was placed under police protection as threats arrived from unknown sources, but he never regretted his decision to ensure that the truth survived Charles's desperate attempt to bury it forever.